Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to spend a little bit of time this morning, spending some time thinking about the whys of Judaism as it relates to the shul, as it relates to the synagogue. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's try to appreciate this. There's so many things we see, we know, but there's so many things we don't know necessarily as well. So let's start at the very beginning. Why is it that the synagogue has so many different names? Right? It has so many different names. It's called the shtibel, the shul, the synagogue, the temple, the Beis Knesset. Like, why does it have so many different names for one institution? So it actually goes back to the evolution of the synagogue.
Did you get to the Zeicha Nishmas?
I did not, thank you. I did not.
We're sponsoring the Zeicha Nishmas for my sister from yesterday's.
I'm so sorry that it didn't come through. We're learning today the Zeicha Nishmas Jack's sister. What's her full name? Esther Etel Bas Alexander Zisha Halevi. Neshama Sheva Aliyah. Thank you so much for making this the context for learning. So I apologize we didn't get that beforehand. Let's start again. Why is it that the shul has so many different names? A shul can be called a temple, a synagogue, a Beit Knesset, there's so many different words for a shul. Why? Why is that? So the truth is, it goes back to the very moment of evolution of the shul. Let's take a moment to think about this. When did the shul come into being? So it came into being at the end of the first base of Mikdash. When the temple, when the Mikdash was destroyed, we know that at that point in time, Yechezkel, who was the Navi, who was already in Galus, he already lived in Babylon, told the nation of Israel, V'ahi lohem Mikdash ma'at. I will be to them as a small sanctuary. That's what Yechezkel said. You can imagine how comforting that is to the Jews who are already living in Babylon in exile, who are the recipients of this tiding. The Gemara Megillah tells us that refers to Eili Bata Knesset or Bata Midrash Shebabavel. It refers to the small sanctuaries in the Babylonian territory. That's how the evolution of, we'll call it the large sanctuary to the small sanctuary. And interestingly enough, that practice continued even when the second Beis HaMikdash was rebuilt. So as an example, if you go up to the top of Masada today, you'll find a shul, right? And you go to old excavations from the Second Temple era, you'll find many shuls, even when there was a Beis HaMikdash. So this we'll call this idea of almost the democratization, right? Where every little community had its place of gathering, became natural. In fact, within the times of the Mishnah and before then, the name of this place was not actually called Mikdash Ma'at, it was called a Beit Knesset. And Knesset literally means gathering. It means a place of gathering. So people would gather together in the shul, which makes a lot of sense. So to gather together to do what? Most likely, pray. That would be the places, the avodah that was performed there in the shul. However, it also assumed other names as well. So, for instance, the word synagogue, which is still used today in the basic description of an Orthodox synagogue, is actually a term from which language? It is Greek. This comes from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible, in which the word synagogue is used, and it means a place of assembly. So essentially it's the Greek translation of the word Beit Knesset, essentially, itself. Why it sticks? Again, it sounds more academic, and that seems to be the way it works in those circles. But that is where the Greek word comes from. As an interesting aside on this topic, is you can find many coins from 2,000 years ago with the Roman stamp on them. And the Romans issued multiple coinages. Coinages was also a way of propagating ideas. So it was essentially if you controlled the coins, you controlled what people would see as they were trading. So there was a very famous line of coins which was called Judah Capta, which is when after the year 70, when the Romans conquered Judea, they put out a line of coins which, interesting enough, is the most frequently found coin. Because they put out 28 different versions of it, as opposed to 6, which was usually the way they did it when they conquered a new territory. The Judea Capta essentially is a picture of a Roman legionnaire standing next to a palm tree. The palm tree was the symbol of Judea, which is the area in Israel. And next to it would be a woman that was in chains, crouched down, crying. That would be Judah captor, which refers to, in Latin, the fact that Judah is now captive, that Rome has conquered Judea. And this coin is very famous. On the reverse side, of course, is a profile of Vespasian, who was the Caesar at the time of the conquest. His son Titus was the general. Okay, so what's interesting is that actually the name of that woman was that woman who was crying took on a different name and image throughout history. When the Christians came about on the top of the entrance to many churches is actually an image of that woman called Synagogue, right, representing the Jewish shul, the Jewish place of gathering, sitting there crouched over, and next to her is a beautiful image of the Christian woman, which is referring to the church, what in Hebrew is called a knessia, right? Similar word, right? And this would be the image, so to speak, taking that Roman image of capturing Judea into the Christian supplanting of the synagogue, the church taking over the synagogue. Interesting enough, in 1958, when Israel marked its 10-year anniversary as a state, they released a coin, and the coin had on the one side Judah captor, which was the same image. On the other side, it replaced it with a farmer farming the land and a woman holding a child. And it was like to mark the nascent rebuilding of Israel. But it's interesting that the woman was called Synagogue, right, as reflecting in Christian ideology the supplanting of the church for the shul. Nonetheless, okay, back to where we are. The institution did take on a number of other names. As an example, the most common one used in basic parlance that we use is the word shul. This actually is from the German or Yiddish, which means literally school, right? So it's with a SC, right? Actually, ULE is the way it's technically spelled, not the way we spell it with SHUL. And that gives another perspective into it, which is it's a place not just of gathering, but it's a place of learning. What we're doing right now is one of the main usages of a shul is a base medrash, is a place of learning, which is where the word shul comes from. Other Yiddishisms, as an example, do appear. So the word shtibel means a small room, right? A small little room. Similarly, like a klois is another German word or Yiddishism, which means literally similar to the word cloister, which means it is sequestered from the rest of the world. And this is how the Jews wanted to live in exile. They didn't want to be noticed. They didn't want. This was a way to take a person away, right? So to sequester them, to put them into the klois, would be a place to succeed outside of society. In the 18th century, starting in the year 1818, there became a new name which was introduced, and this was in Hamburg because with the advent of the Reform movement as an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, we got a new name which was called Temple, right? It became, the first one was called the Hamburg Temple, and today that's the name which is carried through for Reform and Conservative Judaism. What does it mean? So interestingly enough, it has the opportunity or the, so to speak, undercurrent of transforming what became a Migdash Ma'at into the Migdash, essentially, right? Because no longer were we going to be Israel-oriented, mourning over a lost heritage. We're building our heritage right now. Where we are right now is where we deserve to be. The accusation of dual loyalty of a Jew yearning for Israel and a Jew living in German society is no longer. We are in the society, we're fully Germans, and this is our arrival, our Migdash. Didn't work out so well, apparently, but nonetheless, that was an attempt again of Jews trying to amalgamate into the complex societies around them. This is some of the names that are used to describe our places of worship, which is fascinating. Now, let's move a little further afield. You'll notice, and you go to many shuls. In fact, most shuls, certainly in America, you'll notice that there are many plaques around a shul. Why do we have plaques around the shul? So, just this actually is talked about in Halacha. About 800 years ago, Rav Shlomo ibn Aderet, who was a great Spanish Jewish sage living in Toledo, Spain, was asked, are you allowed to put your name on different parts of the shul? The answer, he said, is absolutely yes, and he even recommends it. Why is that? This is Paskin, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Ramah tells us one is and should be allowed to do this. Why is that? So there's two reasons. One is because there actually happens to be different levels of holiness in a shul, and you can't interchange them. So as an example, right, anything which is closer to the Torah, the closer you go to the Torah, is more holy than things that are further away from the Torah. So let's say using the paroiches for something else would be inappropriate. So having a dedication on it is one way of preventing it being misappropriated for something else, right? I'm going to take that cloth and I'm going to use it to cover the shulchan. That's not all right. So having a name on it and having a dedication as to what it is will avoid that. But another reason is that other people will say, you know what? There'll be a little bit of envy. It's like they have their name on this. I'd like to also contribute as well. And similarly, it also allows, the third reason is, it allows the children of a person to be inspired to say, wait a second, my parents, my grandparents thought it important to invest in such a way, and they're going to do it. Just a little secret is that shuls cost a whole lot more than people pay for, right? So just the way it works is that operating major buildings costs a lot of money, much, much, much more than membership pays. Even membership pays in a shul. It's just very, very expensive. So what happens is in the non-for-profit world, what happens is you sell dedications to get people to pay for the things they're using anyway, right? So, but it makes people feel better if they have something to attach their name to, which is very helpful. But understanding it's just a way to pay the basic bills or the costs of these very, very large institutions. But it is talked about and completely acceptable in halacha. Next question is why is it that shuls have these beautiful stained glass windows? So the truth is that stained glass itself is probably coming from the Christian Europe, which is why you don't really see so many Eidut Mizrach shuls with the same focus on stained glass. But when you go to Rome, as an example, and you start looking, in Florence, and you start seeing the Michelangelos and the beautiful stained glass of churches, it makes sense that Jews would want to make their sanctuaries as beautiful as the most beautiful sanctuaries of the age. But so in terms of the actual stained glass itself per se, that's not of halachic interest. There is halachic limitations as to what figures you can place in the stained glass. You're not allowed to just put anything into the stained glass. There's certain images you're not allowed to have in a shul, as an example. And over time you can see really fascinating things, like for instance in the frescoes or on the floors of old shuls, like you found in Israel, you'll find the zodiac. Like today, we don't accept that kind of thing. Like I find the entire circle of the zodiac in the shul. Like there's certain limitations as to what kind of images you can have, but the stained glass may not be allowed, but windows are very much a part of shuls as well. In fact, we know that a shul must have windows, and we know that as an example, the Beis Hamikdash had windows. So the Beis Hamikdash had chalonos shekufim atumim, what that means they were blocked and open at the same time. Generally understood that means to say is that they opened in such a way that they slanted outwards. That was the general understanding. But it could have mean that they were at an angle. It could have mean that they were only one way viewable. There's a lot of discussions that Abba Ben El Hazen about the Beis Hamikdash. But nonetheless, Beis Hamikdash had windows. Similarly, when we hear the story of Daniel, which I recommend everybody learn Sefer Daniel, certainly the first 6 chapters, very accessible and very, very fascinating. So in Daniel, what happened was he was a very successful Jew in the diaspora. So he was in the king's court, he was very successful at interpreting dreams, and he rose to the highest ranks of the king. And then, of course, when Jews succeed in society, everybody else is like, why are the Jews succeeding? And so everybody got very, very, very jealous. So they tried to sabotage him, and it didn't work. He was just good at everything he did. So what they did was they came to the king and they said, "Oh, king, we want to make a new edict, a new regulation on society that no one should pray to any other deity than yourself, right? The king." And so when you speak to large egoed men who become rulers, those kind of things make sense, right? They're like, yeah, of course. Well, that does sound That does sound very good, doesn't it? Right? So he signs into law the edict, and of course they were doing this to sabotage Daniel. Then they went on to spy on Daniel and describes it. Daniel hears about this, and what he does is he goes up to his attic and he opens up the window facing Jerusalem and he starts praying. And at which point in time they come in and they arrest him, and that's when they throw him to the lions, right? Because he is now transgressing the king's new edict, right? So that story emerges from that. But what's interesting is in that description, how does Daniel pray? He opens up the window facing Jerusalem, which in that case was south, and so he's praying in such a way. The Gemara deduces from here that when you pray, you should have windows in the direction that you are facing. In fact, not only just windows, we hear from the later Achronim, this is quoted the Shulchan Aruch, a shul should have 12 windows. In fact, what does that mean? Why 12 windows? So this is understood. The Magen Aram describes this. That means to say is that each of the tribes had a particular aperture or pathway of prayer, which was unique to that tribe, and therefore, as a function of that, we recognize that by having these 12 windows. Another reason for this as well is when one looks at the heavens, one feels a sense of humility. One feels very small, and therefore it allows a person to be able to get the right focus. I believe this is why in so many shuls, when they do have stained glass, what is the pictures on many of stained glass windows? Is the tribes. And the reason in two of our sanctuaries we have that, we have the tribes around the Aron in both the main sanctuary and the Glakelnik base Midrash here, and that's the function of this particular halacha of having those 12 windows, those 12 apertures of connection. So the notion of stained glass in general is not particularly shul-esque, but the idea of 12 windows at the very least is very much shul-esque.
Isn't there something luckily I'm not supposed to daven out a window, all right?
Good question. So you're not supposed to be davening gazing through the window, right? Because that becomes distracting, which is why many shuls have the windows just slightly above eye level. Again, it just also depends where your windows are facing. If your windows are facing the street, then it just becomes a very distracting thing because you're like, oh my goodness, look who's going to work early today. Right? But then, so then in a certain sense, that's very distracting. But if the windows are upwards and a person's shifting their eyes upwards, then there's a sense of majesty, there's a sense of calm, there's a sense of directing one's heart towards Jerusalem, which is what it's meant to be. So there is that balance. And also, if the shul's not made that way, then one should orient oneself that way as well. You'll see sometimes in shuls, they'll have frosted window on the lower level, and then they'll have open windows on the top, and that's because of that balance they're trying to find. Okay, let's come back to the bima for a second. Why the bima? We discussed this a little bit last week when it came to the Torah reading. We know there's a bima for a few reasons. First of all, the time when Ezra and Nehemiah read the special Torah reading by the Shara Hamayim and the water gate outside the base of Mikdash, it describes that a Migdal Eitz, this large platform they stood on, and they read the Torah from it. And clearly that was because of audibility. There has to be a place that people can hear from. Similarly, we know that over 2,000 years ago, we know that in Alexandria, in Egypt, they had a very, very large society, very large Jewish community, and that is magnificent base Knesset there. Magnificent shul, so large, it describes that people could not even hear from one side to the other, so they would wave flags when Amen was needed to be said. And it describes this beautiful shul with a large bima, large shulchan in the middle as well. So we know already, going back over 2,000 years, this notion of having this shulchan in the middle was as such. This is codified into halacha. This is a place where people can hear the Torah reading from as well. We do note as well that this also has other reasons for it. Another reason is that people can sit down. What does that mean? Is that when the Torah leaves the Aron, when the Torah leaves the Ark, it would be inappropriate to sit down. That would be completely disrespectful. But when the Torah is at rest, when it's in a different domain, then you're allowed to sit down. What does that mean? If it's on a platform, which is a different domain, which means it has the dimensions of being at least 10 tvachim high and 4 by 4 tvachim, then it becomes its own domain, and you may sit down because it's not like the Torah is in motion or standing where you are. It's now in a different domain. And the bim is made elevated to emphasize it being in a different domain, which allows you to sit down even though it is out, as an example. That's a halachic reason. Another reason is because it's like the Torah reading is an emblem of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and Sinai was from above, which is why the bima is elevated. When you have small batei medrash like this one that we're in right now, then the bima is just usually a table. But as you get into the larger shuls that are made and have space, they actually have ceiling space, the bima is always elevated as a function of this as well. Now, why is it that the bima is in different places in different shuls? This is fascinating. Generally speaking, if you read all the halachic literature, it was always be'emtza. The bima was always in the center of the shul, and that's so people could hear on all sides. That's why it's in the center. If you look at most rooms, the bima is in the middle. What happened was, unfortunately, in the 19th century, there was a push, that actually is a pun, to get the bima to go to the front of the shul. Why do they want to move it to the front? The reason is because in Reform Germany, when German Jews were pushing to, so to speak, be part of society, they made a number of adjustments to shuls to make them more like churches. So they introduced the organ to the shul, as an example. In fact, if you go to Temple Israel right here on the old sanctuary, they have an organ there. Right, there's an organ in the front. That's just like a church. And another reason is because if you go into a church, which you shouldn't, but you can look at the pictures, they have something at the front called the altar, right? And that is going to be where the sermons are going. That's where the leading of the prayer is. So in an attempt to make the shul more, we'll call it germane to society, they wanted to move the bima to the front. That was opposed vociferously by the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer, of course, was in Frankfurt, and he understood where this was going, and he famously said the phrase at the end of his tshuva, where he says, Chadash Asr, right, that anything which is new is never allowed, and he dismissed this. Today, once the fight has been over, in a certain sense, Reform Jewry has uncoupled itself from traditional Judaism long ago. They have lost most of the basics of Judaism a very significant amount of time ago, unfortunately. So then there becomes, is this still a halachic significance? Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was asked this question, and he says, today there's no specific halachic significance of it being in the center if there's a better place for it. Right? Meaning when the Chasam Sofer was fighting Reform Jewry, yes, that makes sense to fight it today. It doesn't make as much sense. He says, nonetheless, it is best to choose a shul that has the bima in the center, because that is traditionally as we have it. There's always a very interesting discussion about something which isn't particularly formulated in halacha, but more is a tradition. But he said, nonetheless, we should try to do this as well. We move to one other reason why the bima is in the center is for a separate reason. That is the bima actually represents one part of the Beis HaMikdash, and that is the Mizbeach HaZahav, actually, interestingly enough, the golden altar, and that was always found facing the ark in the center of the Kodesh, right? And therefore, as a function of that is one reason why it actually belongs in the center, facing directly in the middle of the shul as well, just representative of the different paraphernalia of the Beis HaMikdash as well. Which brings us to the next, which is, why is there an ark? This is the easiest one, because the word for an ark is an aron. The word for an aron, of course, is the place that contains, in the Beis HaMikdash, contains the Torah and the luchos, the two tablets, the broken tablets, and a Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah is also in there. So when we have our aron, then ultimately it clearly reflects that as well. It's mainly, aron literally means a cabinet, right? A container, right? But we treat it as a reflection of the Ark of the Covenant, which is where the Torah belongs, and this is one of the holiest parts of every shul. And there's lots of interesting questions as to, is it built into the wall? Is it separate? Is it movable? What can you do? There's a lot of very interesting discussions. Can you use it for other things? What else can you store in there? But be it as it may, it's clearly a reflection of the Aron in the Beis HaMikdash, right? So that should be pretty simple. One interesting observation, which is fascinating, and we discussed this a little bit last week, is that the Torah in the Ark of the Covenant lay flat, and the Torah in our Aron is upright, or at least at an angle, depending on an Ashkenazic or Sephardic tradition. The Radvaz explains that our Torah is meant to be used and therefore stands to go out. The Torah in the Beis HaMikdash was lying flat because it was there as a commemoration. It was there as eidos, as testimony. Testimony is not meant to be read out. It's meant to be there, so to speak, as like the platinum meter in France, right? Where it stays there, sort of, is sequestered and guarded as such. Why is there always a curtain, right? So happens to be this Aron is locked right now behind me, but behind it has a curtain. The curtain seems completely unnecessary, right? Meaning, if you have doors to an Aron, then you don't need to have a curtain, right? So why does every Aron have a curtain? And the answer is the name of that curtain is called The paroches, which is obviously gives us a clue as to what it is. The paroches was initially in the Mishkan. There was a paroches which was a dividing curtain between the two domains, between what's called Kodesh and Kodesh HaKadoshim, between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. It indicated a separation which indicated an increase in holiness as well. Interestingly enough, if you're architecturally oriented, you will notice that when the curtains of the Mishkan were created, they were created in strips, right? So they did not have the equipment to make one large curtain, right? They simply do not. So what do? They made these long strips of curtains, and then they sewed them together, right? There was 5 and then 6 and 5 and 5, and they sewed 5 together and 5 together, and then those were connected through 50 loops and hooks. Right? That's why I did it. Which is strange, because they should have just sewn all the long strips, which would be draped over the Mishkan together. Why did they have the loops and the hooks? Well, if you actually calculate exactly where they lived directly above the paroches. Okay, so meaning to say like this: there would be 20 amos of the sanctuary, then there'd be the paroches and the last 10 amos, and then the curtains would drape over the back, which was 10 amos long, right? There was 1 amo of the thickness of the wall, and then 9 amos down the back. So the immediate center of those hooks and loops was above the paroches, meaning the outside curtains also reflected the division in domains, spiritually as well as the internal curtain. Just worthwhile doing, because it doesn't say that explicitly, but if you do the calculations, it's very clear that it's a domain differentiator. Notice, by the way, that in the Mishkan, anytime there was a domain differentiator, there were angels. So there were 3. As an example, there was the curtains above the entire sanctuary, had angelic figures actually in it. Then the paroches was the next one, which had angelic figures on it. And then there was the kapores, which was the third one, which separated even the Kodesh from the Aron, and that also had angels on it. Every time you have a separation of domain, they had angels. Okay, be it as it may. That's why we have paroches. It's worthwhile noting that the Beis HaMikdash was slightly different. In the Beis HaMikdash, they had something which was called the Amatraxen, which was actually a wall which separated the two sanctuaries. The first Beis HaMikdash had a wall. In the second Beis HaMikdash, they had 2 parochim. Right, so the second Beis HaMikdash, they had these very, very large hanging curtains. There were 2 of them with a small gap between them. And what would happen is the Kohen would go in on the right side between the 2 curtains, walk all his way to the left, and then turn in and come to where the actual Aron was on Yom Kippur. Just to be aware of this, there was a evolution of this throughout the course of history. So if you look at different images of the Beis HaMikdash, you'll see it looks quite different to the Mishkan, which only had 1 parochas. But nonetheless, our parochas is reflective of that, and it has a higher level of holiness than other elements in the shul as well. Just to be worth of it. Why is there a light always above the Aron? So this is what's often called the Ner Tamid. Having lights in a shul is really an important thing. In fact, there is a halacha that you should have many lights in a shul. It expresses honor. It expresses the ability of it being something beautiful, especially in the days pre-electricity. Today, we just flick a switch, 1, 2, 3. It's all good. We're replacing our fluorescence with LEDs right now, and it's fantastic. It's even lighter, and it's great. The halacha is you should have a light and honorable shul. However, the idea of having one light which remains all the time is a reflection of something which was always there. What was always there? So there happens to be, there's a lot of things that are always there. If you look for the word tamid in Parashas Truma and Tetzaveh, you'll see there are a lot of tamids as an example. So one of the tamids is the menorah had a constant light. The Ketores was called tamid. And similarly, the Mizbeach also, Eish Tamid Tukad on Mizbeach Lo Sichbeh, refers to the light, the fire on the Mizbeach as well. Then it had to be constant. Now, how constant was constant? The Gemara Menachos discusses. What does constant mean? The showbread should be there constantly as well. Does that mean that when you put the new bread in, you had to push out the old bread at the same time, so there was always bread on it? Or does it mean, no, you could take it off as long as the same day, the same hour, it was sufficient to be always? But nonetheless, we have the Ner Tamid, which reflects all the 3 fires which were supposed to be Tamid. The candle in the menorah, the fire on the Mizbeach of the Ketores, and the fire on the Mizbeach HaNochashes as well. Yes, so that's an excellent question. So technically speaking, candles don't last forever. So what they would do is they would do it twice a day to be able to have a continual, that would be considered enough to be considered Tamid. However, it should be known that there was this notion of the Ner Ma'aravi, the westernmost candle, which would be lit all the time, and that miracle lasted to the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash. At the times of Shimon HaTzadik, that miracle stopped. After Shimon HaTzadik was the last of the remaining people of the Ayim Knesset Gdola. Just fun fact for people to realize this, is the westernmost candle was not the edge candle. Because just like if you look at the Mishnah, the Maseches Tamid, it means the second from the end, the westernmost from that end. So it was the second candle, which was the one that always remained until the times of Shimon HaTzadik. Just a fun fact, but nonetheless, that is probably also reflective of that miracle as well. Let's move into the next thing. Why is there a women's section and not just one seating section in the synagogue? I have to tell you that if there was family seating, everything would be a lot quieter in Shul and Shabbos. Right? It's when you're with your friends. That's when all the conversations get going. The decorum would be very, very successful. But why is it that they're separate seating? So I remember I was actually taking a family through to the shul who were not observant Jews, and they're like, wow. So you put the woman here at the back. I could I could hear the sort of back of the bus treatment. I was like, from the outside, it's like that sounds very, very, very strange. Many shuls are built side by side, but nonetheless, why is that? Why is there a separate section? So the truth is that this goes back already to the times of the Beis Hamikdash. There was a section of the Beis Hamikdash called the Ezras Nashim. Ezras Nashim. In fact, just a fun story is that I went to a small little house shul in Baltimore recently where my brother-in-law was davening, and they were about to build. But then all the neighbors, the non-observant neighbors, of course, are trying to zone them out and bring them to court. And they're suing them. And one of the reasons they're suing them is because they said, you're going to have ambulances here all day long, and it's going to affect things. So I said, why do you think we have ambulances? It's because you're building an Ezras Nashim. He says, no, that means the women's section. It does not mean, they thought it meant, the word Ezra meant Hatzalah, right? So no, it's like, no.
It's an organization.
Yes. Yeah, they thought it was the women's division of Hatzalah that they were bringing in from Brooklyn, but they were like, no, we do not. This is not what we're talking about. Nonetheless, so the Ezras Nashim, the women's we'll call courtyard, was actually the largest courtyard in the Beis Hamikdash. If you look at there's the sanctuary, which most people weren't allowed into. Then they had the steps, Ezra Yisrael, Ezra Levium, Ezra Kohanim, and then the Ezras Nashim was large open hall. That was probably where almost the events took place in the Beis Hamikdash, was in Ezras Nashim. And the Gemara describes, this is based on the Mishnah and Maseches Midos, which describes the dimensions of the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara in Sukkah describes that they had different permutations of how this worked. At the beginning, they had the men on the inside, the women on the outside. Right, but the men would just still go out and, fraternize. And then they said, well, maybe we'll put the women on the inside and the men on the outside, so then the men were gazing. Right, men have a problem. It's not the women's section is not for the men. It's not for the women, it's for the men. Right? So then they made a tikkun gadol. They made this great, progressive step where they placed they made balconies so the women would be able to see and they would not be intermingling. And the Gemara describes two concerns in the process. It describes one is just frivolous intermingling on the outside, taking a smoke together while everything else is going on in the center. And the other is gazing, is men gazing at the women in the holy of places. So that it goes back to the times of the Beis Hamikdash as well. Should be noted that for many centuries, women did not come to shul in general, right? So the idea of if you go to the old Batei Knesset that you find uncovered in Israel, there wasn't a women's section, and that's not because they were progressive in that respect. It was just because the women didn't come to shul. It was a place to pray, and that was it. And most women were unschooled and unlettered till very recently, just in society. Forget Judaism, right? But be it as it may. When shuls were developed in Europe, you'll find that most of them have balconies. Right, large shuls have balconies. That is reflective of the Beis Hamikdash. Even today, many large shuls have balconies, second-tier balconies, which allow visual and audible access, but not the mingling and fraternization. However, the idea of family seating actually is something which developed not in Europe; it developed in America. And the reason for that is because the churches in America developed family seating before the churches in Europe. Just the way it goes. And therefore, Reform Judaism, which was always chasing non-Jewish society to try to be like it, tried to become more like the churches in America than it did like the churches in Europe. As an example, even in Germany, where the Reform movement was founded, still had separate seating well into the 20th century. They would not accept this new movement, and that's because the churches had separate seating. In America, family seating became a thing, and therefore already in the 1850s, we see up in Albany, New York, the movement towards family seating was when a shul bought a church as to be used, and that temple, they decided they did not want to renovate it to make a women's section. They said, let's do family seating. That was when it started. It was around year 1848. You can read, Jonathan Sarna has a very fascinating essay on this particular topic about the advent of it, but it was clearly an American phenomenon before it was a European phenomenon, and that was a reflection of the churches in America as opposed to the churches in Europe. So it clearly should be observed as an assimilation into society, and therefore depending on what that society is doing as to the family seating. Today we still have the division of men and women sitting, certainly for worship, for the times that they're actually davening in a shul, and the question then becomes what places require, what places don't require it, what happens if it's a simcha, right? What happens if it's a wedding? Like, when do you need a mechitza? What happens if a funeral? All these things, and you sort of see some communities being very, very machmir when it comes to this, and other communities saying, it was meant to be in a shul, perhaps in a davar shebekdusha, but perhaps other areas not as important. Why do you see different heights of mechitzas? So in some shuls, it's more like like a hurdle, like in the horse races, when the horse needed to jump over the hurdles, it's more like that. In some shuls, it's like bulletproof. You couldn't imagine there's even other people on the other side of that. So where does this come from? So it depends what the actual function of it is. If the function of it is to prevent mingling, then a division is sufficient. What's a division in halacha? Is a mechitza. How big is a mechitza? Mechitza is 10 tvachim for it to act as a mechitza, minimally. Mechitza, 10 tvachim is roughly 36 inches high off the ground, and that's sufficient at least. Whereas if the issue is just to prevent people staring at each other at a time when they're supposed to be praying, then it would be a little bit higher, right? Which is why you'll see in certain shuls, you'll have things like one-way glass or lattices, where it's a bit harder to see, but it's still a division, and there's many very creative different options that are created in order to be able to achieve this as well. Why do different shuls face different directions? This is pretty clear. And that's because all shuls in the world, except for the ones where the architect made the plans before they consulted the rabbis, all face Jerusalem. They all face Jerusalem, and this is clear. Which is why, although when I grew up, there was a woman in our community who came from America, and she had a beautiful sign on the wall which said Mizrach, which meant east. We all said to her, why east? Because in South Africa we all faced north, right? In Australia they all face west, right? So it's just the way it is. Everybody's facing Jerusalem. An interesting question becomes is that if you look at your plane map the next time you fly to Israel, you do not fly east to get to Israel. You fly northeast. And that's because on a sphere, the easiest way to travel is to go towards the poles, because the distance covered is fast as you go to the poles, which is why the flights are always curved. They're going to the poles, you cover more distance when you go further north or south, depending on which pole you're closer to. So the question becomes, so do we face northeast? So generally speaking, we do as if it is flat earth, which is that we daven eastward facing. However, it's worthwhile noting that when there was I believe it's Agudas Yisrael of Park Heights in Baltimore, when they were making their shul, the shul was on such an angle that they had the choice of either going, how did it go? Northeast or southeast. They made the Aron on the southeast side, on the northeast side, because the northeast side is actually more correct than the southeast side, because it is facing Jerusalem in a faster way if you're to fly there. Right, as well. We don't assume that tefillos are flying via the El Al route necessarily, right? Which is why they do have the capacity of going straight through the crust of the earth as well, and do not need necessarily the curvature. But nonetheless, being as that's the case, just something to bear in mind in terms of shuls. This is important to realize just on a political level as well, which is that mosques, when people are praying in mosques, they're all facing Mecca, including on the Temple Temple Mount. So they have their backsides facing the Dome of the Rock as they pray towards Mecca. It's important just realizing where the center of each religion is. And that being the case is sort of why Jerusalem is so central to us. We shouldn't take that for granted as part of our education process. Finally, why is it that people walk out of shul backwards? And the truth is that the Ramah tells us that when you leave a shul, you should bow slightly. You should bow slightly. The Magen Avraham says you should not face your back towards the Aron as you leave the shul. You should you should walk at least sideways in a respectful way, so you're not doing this. And you'll see this sometimes, even when people leave the bimah. Let's say it's the front bimah where the Aron is. You'll see them walk down the stairs backwards, not to turn their back to the Aron. You'll see this also at the Kotel Plaza. You'll see how sometimes you'll go the ramps that lead to the different sections. You'll see that people walk backwards as well as a reflection of that. It doesn't necessarily mean backwards. It just means that you shouldn't be facing your back towards the Aron. And as the Ramah says, you should be slightly bowed as an expression of submission. So here are some thoughts, some whys that relate to the shul. There's so many different aspects of a shul. I'm going to close here. Any further whys that you'd like to explore that I did not yet find addressed? Well, Yossi?
There used to be lions.
Oh, yes.
Now they're obsolete.
Yeah, lions used to be a big thing. There are lots of different images that seem to be like we'll call it the template of a lot of these things on Torahs, on the Parochsim as well. It seems to be that's a symbol of strength, the symbol of right on the sides of Luchos. They used to have that was a very common figure. I don't really know specifically. I do know that it is one of the 4 symbols that's described in Pirkei Avos, which is quoted in the first Sif in Shulchan Aruch, where is Hiskaber Ka'ari Lamoid Baboker Lavodas Habara, which is that you wake up like a lion in order to serve the Creator. Just a fun fact on that point is that if you've ever watched a lion, we went to South Africa in this last summer, lions don't get up so vigorously, if you know what I'm saying, right? In fact, a male lion spends 22 hours a day sleeping. So it's like the example used is perhaps not the best. So actually, I heard Rabbi Natan Slifkin when he was here a few years ago to make a very, very interesting observation, and that is the lion is the only cat which actually hunts in packs, or in prides, more technically, as opposed to any other cat which is a loner, right? The leopards, the cheetahs, any other feline hunts alone, so the idea of gevura usually actually refers to the idea of holding back. It's not about strength. Gevura is the idea of finding the balance and power, and so lions have the gevura in the sense that they actually operate as a pride, which perhaps indicates about the way that we get up in the morning should be with enough space for others, which is really just perhaps insight. That's perhaps why it is. I think perhaps is that whoever made the template, it was like one template. Like if you go today, if you unfortunately have to go into the tombstone store, right? And you ask them, what can I put on the tombstone? They have 3 templates, right? There's the candles, there's the Magen David, and there's what's the other one? And so like the thing, and the hands the coin. But that's it. Basically, they only have. So I think the lions was one of those for many, many centuries before we got to advanced printing and embroidering as well. Siri.
Why can't the Chazan daven at the same place that you read the Torah? Why do you have 2 of them?
That's a really good question. I remember reading about this, and I don't remember the answer to that. Which is why it is that the Shliach was supposed to lead the people, but at the same time be heard by the people. I think the leading is always seen as the front. As an interesting aside that you mention it, if you go to some European shuls, and in fact some shuls as well, you'll notice that the area over here is actually lower. Right? So in fact, there's a step down for the chazan to say, which is not very good for the audio, right? It's not good to be able to hear, but it's the idea of Shir HaMa'aros Ma'akim Krasicha Hashem, where I call out from the depths, so the humility of the leader. But as to in terms of the middle or the front, I think the front is seen as more of leadership, the middle is more of being able to hear in shuls which are very large as well. Yeah. Yeah, Yossi?
Well, you mentioned that the first shul was towards the end of the first Beis HaMikdash period. So what were they doing before that?
Coming to the Beis HaMikdash.
No, let's say when they weren't Beis HaMikdash. So a guy who's
also a good question. So in fact, in the first Beis HaMikdash, they did not have formalized prayer.
Right.
So the prayer was only formalized at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash. So the notion of ritual was also. So you would have people like, as the Gemara gives an example. The Gemara gives an example about a fellow called Binyamin Raya, which Raya means shepherd, right? So Ben the shepherd, right? So it says that he used to say before, he would say, Brich Rachman to the high pita. He said, blessed be God of the one who of this bread. That's how, So he had this organic expression of prayer, and that would be around all experiences in his life, the lows and the highs and the in-betweens. He'd sort of organically say, oh, God, you're so good about things. But there wouldn't be a place, and there wouldn't be a format of how to say it.
Was it a 3 times a day organized thing? Are people did
No, it doesn't sound like that.
But yet,
No. So we had the idea of Avram being Misakin, Tfilas Shachris, and so on. But formally speaking, were people doing the 3 times a day? We know that that Midah Oraisa, that tefillah has to be once a day, right? That's so. But the idea of 3 times a day a minyan, it doesn't seem that's what they were doing at that point in time. Anshe Knesset formalized it as well. They realized that lacking ritual led to complete disaster and assimilation. Meaning, the exile in Babylon led to them everything falling apart. They said, no, we need to have fixed places, fixed ways, fixed words, fixed times.
Would go to your farm. You wouldn't.
Yeah, for sure.
Shema was always twice a day.
Shema had to be twice a day, for sure. But in terms of the formalization, in terms of every aspect of form, that was beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash, including the place, which is the base Knesset as well. Fascinating. Steve.
The lions, I've seen 3-dimensional, basically they're carvings. And how does that with not making graves with an image?
Oh, good question. So that's one of the questions about regulations. Is animals? There's no problems of having 3-dimensional animals. It becomes a problem when it happens to be human images and images of the celestial spheres, right? Those are the two which have more restrictions on them, but animals themselves aren't so much of an issue. In fact, in the Beis Hamikdash itself, the Beis Hamikdash had animal figures. So as an example, Yam Shel Shlomo, which was a large mikveh, which was in the Beis Hamikdash, was supported by 12 images of cows that supported this large image. There was lots of different images in the Beis Hamikdash, but you have to be careful about what was actually on the different items themselves. Alan?
Wasn't there also something about what the shul is called? Because you're not allowed to eat in a shul. So
yes.
Call something based
Oh yes, that's a really excellent point. I didn't mention this before, and we'll close to this. But that is that why is that in some shuls you'll see people eating, some people you won't eat in other shuls. So technically speaking, you're not allowed to use a shul, a synagogue, for personal use in any way whatsoever, right? So you're not allowed to sleep in it, you're not allowed to eat in it, you're not allowed to drink in it, because this is not your domain. It's not just like you come here to watch a movie and pull out the popcorn, right? So it's not appropriate at all. However, a lot of times a shul, in many times, was just one room, right? Everything was done in that one room. So what they do, they would make it what's called a Beit Knesset, were made al t'nai. They're made on condition. What that t'nai means is not so simple, because according to some of the Mefarshim, that t'nai just meant that if it was destroyed, you could use the stones. That's all the t'nai allowed you to do. Understood. The more makil way of understanding is that it gave a little more flexibility for usage, even when it was extant. But the reason why many shtibbles are called shtibbles is because they did not designate them with even Kedushas Beis Knesset in the first place. Meaning, to avoid this question, the reason why a shtibble is called a shtibble is they did not want the holiness of a shul in order to be able to avoid this, so they could just pull out the cholent on a Shabbos morning without there being a question. Bearing that in mind, you should realize that therefore it's not as holy, right? Because they did not dedicate it as a shul, right? So meaning, if it's a shul, you have to navigate using it for other usages. If it's not a shul, you don't have to worry about that, but it's not holy in the same way. So that's our shuls are Bate Knesset al Tanai. All our shuls are Bate Knesset al Tanai, which is why we have other programs in a shul, but generally speaking, we don't usually have food in our shuls. That's why we have a ballroom, which is separate, which is why it's an extra cost, right? We built another room separately for the eating part of it, which is a major financial undertaking as well. Yeah.
It wouldn't need a mezuzah if it was a regular Beis Knesset.
Yes. So regular Beis Knesset does not need mezuzah, but the donors do like mezuzahs. just saying it as it is. But technically speaking, unless it's actually a shtibble, people actually sleeping and so on in the shul part of it, it is. But it's a beautiful thing and so on. But in terms of the actual technical chiyuv, the chiyuv of mezuzah is not required on a Beis Knesset because people aren't sleeping in the Beis Knesset. So in that response, there was not necessary. Next week in Mitzvah Hashem, we're going to come to the Jewish home. So now we're moving away from the prayer and so on. We're going to now move into the whys of the Jewish home. Thank you everybody for joining. Have a wonderful